part 2 of our skulls project. This is how we'll wrap it up. So I start with one of the harder pencils, an HB, and of course you want to kind of use your kneaded eraser, which is that gray eraser, to just kind of clean up the page, dust it off, and then we're going to start with our contour drawing process. So we're going to superimpose thick versus thin, light versus dark, open versus closed, types of lines in an effort to create variation. Remember, there are 5 reasons. There's primary versus secondary versus tertiary detail. You can see me there working on some of those tertiary details. Probably have either the HB or 2B because it's got a lot more clay and it's harder, but it does give me a darker line. And then I can come in with my 8B or my 6B on its side and get some of those really dark lines, really thick lines. Notice though that I'm leaving lots of space where we have passage, meaning the edge doesn't go all the way around. And if you look at the skull in this area, it does have an open passage versus here where our eye gets blocked by that edge because there's a lot of contrast. So as you squint at this, you can see that there are lines like these shadow lines between light and shadow, which is another reason for doing contour, that are very soft. And then you have edge lines like this, where you have light against dark, that are very crisp and focused. So if you squint, what you're doing is you're activating the rods in your eyes, which are the light sensing organs in your eyes. That's what enables your eyes to adjust when you're in a dark room. And if you squint for a while, and you do have to squint for a while, you'll be able to tell the difference between a hard edge and a soft edge, or a lighter tone or a darker tone. You'll be able to see where the darkest areas of contrast are, like this little gap in the mouth, the eye sockets, this little shadow here. You notice that here I've created some very light, thin lines that stand for this light area here, where the light and the dark are. Dealing with the roots of the teeth here. Now, I am looking at the teeth now, and you'll notice that I'm not drawing each tooth individually. I'm drawing the top of the tooth, I'm drawing the bottom of the tooth. I'm looking, scanning upward, seeing, okay, how many teeth fit between a vertical line that drops down from my eye back? Well, you can see it's about 3 teeth. So I come over here and I drop down a line, and I try to fit in 3 teeth. How many teeth fit between the side of the nose and the front of the mouth? 1, 2, 3. So if I come over here, drop a line down, 1, 2, 3 teeth. So what you're doing is constantly vertically scanning, and this is especially important in small textures like teeth, or tertiary details like teeth. You can see I'm not simply tracing over things. I'm creating variation to the line. Now, right now, I'm not erasing to get rid of, I'm erasing to smooth out and to create another type of line quality. So you can literally use your eraser to kind of smear. Notice how I went right over the edge, because I want to have a little bit of line variation. Remember, change over distance. If I was to just draw a contrasting crisp line around the edge of this skull, it would be boring. So remember, the 5th reason, I believe, for contour lining was to create variation over distance, so the line's just not the same over its whole length. Doing a little bit of cleanup in the margins, not to get rid of my calculation or my constructive lines or my diagrammatic lines, but just to clean up a smear. So you really want to think about, what areas can I see more? What areas can I see less? What area would be more appropriate with a dark focus line? What area would be better with less contrast? For instance, these teeth have more contrast in between them than this row of 3 teeth here, which are in shadow. Now I'm moving on to the frontal view, and I'm looking at this little edge here, which is a plane, which describes the thickness of that bone. I added it here because I noticed it here. I didn't notice it in the picture before. I'm dealing with the brow ridge. Now you'll notice if you squint at that brow ridge that it's very soft compared to, say, the dark against light that you have here. This is very soft because the nose just gradually turns into the orbit, as opposed to here where you have this very deep, sharp edge. So you want to look at that. If you squint, you can see that there's not that much of an edge there. Inside that nose, you have this septum that's dividing the left and the right halves. Notice how you can see it more here, and as you move downward, you can see it less. Look at this plane change here. There's a shift from light to shadow right there. So that's a nice soft edge. And basically, it defines the front plane of the face. Remember, the front of the box versus the side of the box. The front of the box to here versus the side of the box. You can really see some pronounced root structure here, which is relatively light. You want to draw that, but not as focused as you're drawing these edge lines. Now I'm making, open marks. I'm flicking my pencil. And I'm letting those marks kind of trail off at the end, as opposed to having a very blunt edge. So here you'll notice a blunt, closed edge, and then as we move down from the cheekbone into the maxilla, you notice how that edge just kind of fades away. Again, in the skulls, here is a moment of overlap. So this part is closer to you than this part. This part of the jaw goes behind this part. So this part should be darker, and this should be lighter as it goes behind. And you'll notice that this gets grayer and this plane is lighter, so that fades back and this comes forward. So it's actually a logical conclusion. It's not just artsy, it's actually about observation. Now there is areas for artsiness, like distributing these lines around the skull or over the whole composition so that things are more cohesive, or creating change over distance so that a line isn't boring but has open areas. This is called passage, where the eye can pass from outside to inside the figure. If you look and you squint at this skull, you'll notice that my eye doesn't penetrate the skull here because this is a very dark light contrast. But as you move into here, that line softens a little bit because this tone is a little bit lighter in value than this tone is. So it contrasts less with this light background. And as we come over here, you can barely see that edge. Squint. If you're not squinting, you really need to squint right now and look and see how your eye just passes freely. And that's because the tones are similar. Over here we see something similar in this area versus up here where it's very focused. Drawing that edge line of the shadow, looking at the sutures on top of the head, making sure that there's variation. I'm kind of pulsating my pencil so that it gets lighter and darker and lighter and darker. You really need to pay attention to pressure. There I was just dealing with this reflected highlight, and you'll notice that in all three views of the skull, there are these little white patches, these reflected highlights. This skull is actually pretty gray in value. The only truly white things in the skull are these highlights. Even the teeth are gray or light gray compared to these highlights. That's going to become important even when we're drawing the skull with flesh on it, because there's very little actual light. Even in the lightest skinned person, the skin is not white. The only white is reflected light off the tip of the nose or the glint in the eye. Everything's a relative value. Again, I want to say, I'm not just tracing over things. I'm making adjustments. So you can see how I made a major adjustment to that skull. Some of you made your skulls droop down too much. Some of you made them too high and too round. So you really want to look at this skull and make some modifications to it. Don't believe that your first observation is the correct one. It's kind of like you're taking notes and you're not worried about spelling errors, you're not worried about grammar, you're out in the field studying, I don't know, turtles or something, and you're just making random observations. It's only later that you come back and you refine those observations into something that's more intelligible, something that is more structured in sentences and paragraphs and has flow and linearity to it. Well, it's the same thing in drawing. When you do those diagrammatic efforts in the beginning, or those constructive line efforts in the beginning, you're purposely making mistakes. It's the whole point. You can't see the truth, the correct final image right away, because you're starting with a blank page. You have to make mistakes and then correct those mistakes. So if you're making mistakes, don't get frustrated. You're supposed to be. This is why I say don't start over. That would be like studying turtles in the field, and before you get back to the studio, or sorry, your office to write your paper, you crumble it up and throw it away. Well, you've just wasted all of that effort, and you're not going to remember it all. You're going to start over by having to go back out in the field and make the observations again. So just erase, not to get rid of, but to create a less contrasting image, and then make corrections with the contours on top. You can see I'm just finishing up with some of those tertiary details. You'll notice that most of the darker lines are around major, primary, and secondary shapes. The tertiary lines tend to be the more broken lines, the lighter lines, the thinner lines. Again, using my eraser not to get rid of, but to smooth, to create variation over distance. Okay. Now you want to look at all three and see if there's a way to kind of harmonize all three. Ask yourself, are there darker, thicker lines more present in one relative to the others, or have you kind of balanced all three? So you want to look at the drawing as a whole, not the individual skulls. All right. So now I'm going to pause here on me about to grab my glasses with my eyes closed, looking very dignified. This next part of the video is going to be about where to photograph your work and how to photograph it, so that you have to do as little post-production editing in Photoshop or Office Lens or in Preview or whatever photo editing software you have, so you can prevent that. So how do we set up a good lighting situation that doesn't have shadows? How do we make sure that when we're looking through our our camera's viewing lens, that our drawing is parallel with the horizontal and vertical edge of our viewing window, so that we don't have to correct for that trapezoidal keystone effect. So I'm just going to let this play, and I'll see you in just a few minutes here. Photographing your work. Right now I'm in my studio, and indoor lighting is really not the best lighting to use to photograph your work. So here I've got this overhead fluorescent, and it's going to tend to make the drawing a little bit yellow, sometimes too blue. The good thing about this is that there's no shadows, so that's an excellent advantage to photographing the work in a vertical manner. If I'm photographing it from above, you can see that there's a shadow from my hand. Sometimes there'll be a shadow from you. So you want to try to find no shadows and good natural light is going to be your best bet. So let's walk outside and we'll find a good spot to photograph your work. I know this is really bad production value on this video, but it'll get the point across. So there's a couple of places that are going to be good for photographing your work. Out here underneath the sky directly, not so good, although on a cloudy day when the sun isn't shining directly, it might be good. If you can find a place that's kind of in shadow, that's a good place as well. Sometimes underneath a really dense tree, where there's not dappled light coming through, that can be a good idea as far as a place to photograph your work. But since it's cloudy today, I'm going to go ahead and focus or take the photograph out here. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get these as close to the edge as I can so that they don't wind up in my photograph. And then I'm going to come back here and I'm going to try to get my image in the page as lumpus as we can. That means that it's as square to the sides of the format as they possibly can be. Okay, I just want to make a note. This is a horizontal drawing, right? It's meant to be looked at horizontally, not vertically like we have it oriented here. However, if I photographed it in this vertical format of my camera horizontally, it would be very small. So if I turn my camera on its side and frame it that way, number one, I'm going to get a better focus because it's not as far away. It'll be a higher quality, more focused image. And it's easier to get that equidistant kind of cropping here and here. Notice that I'm trying to keep the same distance here as I am here, the same distance here all the way across as I am there, and that way I don't have to correct for keystoning. That's going to make it easier when it comes to cropping. So try to take a good photograph to begin with if you're going to get that perfect shot. You want to get it with as little manipulation as you possibly can. Okay, so this is the final image. You can see some diagrammatic marks still are present, though they're not really visible. I've gone ahead and kind of just softened them a little bit. You can see that my page looks very white. My marks have a good range of dark lines versus lighter lines. You can see these soft open areas here versus these more focused areas here. So this is what a good finished drawing and photograph of that drawing should look like. So again, these are due on the next synchronous class day by 9 o'clock in the morning. You upload them to the assignments folder, not the discussions folder. We'll see you during the next class. Have a great day.